In high school, I was just another average test taker. Today, not only have I scored in the top 0.1% on some of the hardest exams in the world, but I've helped thousands of students transform their test performance on the USMLEs and other exams, ranging in age from 9 years old all the way to 50 plus. Some have gone from failing to scoring in the top 3% or even higher, while others from below average to exceptional. After seeing these principles work across so many different students and exams, one thing became crystal clear. Top test performance is not about natural ability. Instead, it's about understanding the patterns that every single exam follows and the mistakes that we make on them. Let me show you exactly what I've learned. To get a top score on any exam, you have to recognize that every question you miss on a test is going to fall into one of two categories. And understanding this distinction is the key to your transformation. The first kind of question that people get wrong are knowledge gaps. These are things that we typically think of, right? They're things of like, we just didn't know it, or we didn't have a deep understanding of the topic, or we forgot it. For the most part, I'd say that roughly 50% of the questions that people miss on exams that I've seen fall in this category, where the bottleneck really is how well you understand, retain, or can apply the information. The second type of mistakes that people make on exams fall into the category of execution errors. These are questions where after you get them wrong, you probably thought like, man, I should get this right. They're things where you might look at the answer explanation and think, wow, I knew this, but how did I not apply it correctly? Most people focus on the first kind of mistake where they just don't know it, but it's important to note that the fastest way to improve one's score is actually to cut down on the mistakes that you make on things that you already know. In addition to this, typically, to go from a low score to like an average to above average score, you can typically get there with knowledge. If you want to get an exceptional score, what you need to do is you need to cut down on these errors. Since those are the things that typically, in my experience, separate people that score in the top, 1, 2, or 3% from those that score in the top, say like, 30 or 40% on an exam. Remember, what got you here won't necessarily get you there. Meaning, if you've seen your score improve a lot by just getting more knowledge, to improve it further, oftentimes is going to involve solving a different problem. To understand how to build that strong foundation, let's start with the secret weapon that top performers use to get more out of their studying. Have you ever noticed how the brightest students in your class always seem to explain things differently when they're asked a question? When I asked someone who did very well on some of the standardized exams like AP tests or SATs, their response almost always included an explanation of why something is. So for example, in biology class, they didn't just memorize that chlorophyll and heme both have porphyrin rings. Instead, they went deeper, right? They understood why that was significant, and they understood the connections between how a porphyrin ring in chlorophyll makes it green, and that same porphyrin ring structure in heme makes it red. What I noticed when I looked at other top performers is that they followed this similar pattern. They typically were trying to understand things at a deeper level, and they kept using the question, why? Why does this make sense? This is critical for exam performance for several reasons. One is that things like board exams or the MCAT or AP tests typically are going to test both recall and application. This is going to strengthen both abilities, since if you understand why, it'll help you remember it better. And if they change the details, which they're likely to do, you'll be able to apply it to novel situations. Now that we understand why this approach is so powerful, let's look at a revolutionary tool that can help us master it faster than ever before. That tool is AI. Now, while AI is not perfect at everything, it's transforming how we can discover the why behind complex topics. I've pushed AI to the limits in terms of trying to understand how best we can use it to make ourselves better test takers and learners. What I consider to be effective flashcards is very different from maybe what it is that it was trained on. Instead, where I found that AI really excels is explaining connections and underlying principles. In other words, it can be a really effective way to discover why something is. I prefer to use tools like Perplexity that give you references as opposed to things like ChatGPT or Claude, which at the time of this recording don't give you references. The thing that you have to worry about whenever you use generative AI is the hallucinations, right? Where it tells you something that sounds reasonable, but it is actually untrue. That's the big risk. Whenever you learn something using generative AI, you want to make sure that what you're learning is actually true. What is the reason that blood is red? Blood is red due to hemoglobin and protein, blah, blah, blah. When iron reacts with oxygen, it produces a red color. Hemoglobin can, yes, exactly, a red colored heme. Let's try this. What about the structure of heme makes it a red color? This is actually a really good explanation, right? Because, right, you've got a porphyrin ring, and because of the porphyrin ring, specifically it's the conjugated double bonds, which allows for there to be delocalization of electrons and specifically allows for absorption of light in the visible spectrum. And so what's useful is that it also gives me the reference to this. So I can actually go here and I can check and make sure that that is in fact true. So in medical school, I never had this kind of tool. And so I would have to basically search on like PubMed or on Google or things like that. And it was really challenging. Like I had to spend sometimes like hours trying to figure out a reasonable explanation for something that now I can find in a matter of minutes. When you combine the power of trying to figure out why something is with the power of generative AI to try to come up with a reasonable first approximation of an explanation that you can then verify later, it can supercharge your learning so that you can have the kind of foundation that top test takers have. So the real secret of top performance isn't just understanding why, it's recognizing that seemingly different subjects often follow the same underlying principles. So once you understand this pattern, you can't unsee it. And it's one of the most powerful things that I've seen top test takers leverage again and again. If you can understand one principle and apply it to hundreds, if not thousands of different situations, it'll make it easier for you to learn new things. It'll make it easier to remember it, and it'll make you a much better test taker because you'll be able to apply it much more easily. Let me give you an example of one of these universal patterns. Inflammation increases the sensitivity of reflexes and sensations in general, right? This is just a general principle. If you understand this, it makes it so much easier to learn medicine. I had a viral upper respiratory infection recently. Something touches one of my airways, sets off a cough, is more sensitive to things, so that even cold air is strong enough to cause me to want to cough. Because I understand this, it makes it easier and faster to understand anything related to the subjects of inflammation and reflexes that the body has. So for example, if you've ever had a urinary tract infection, right, a UTI, the symptoms are explained by this increase in sensitivity that you get in inflammation. Normally, if my bladder is full of urine, right, maybe it takes like 500 milliliters of urine before it starts to feel really full and like I need to run to the bathroom. If I've got an infection, I've got inflammation of my bladder, now because of this increase in sensitivity, it will take much less stretch for my bladder to feel full. And so because of this, people with urinary tract infections have to run to the bathroom much more frequently and with much more urgency. It's a lot easier for me to understand this because I understand the principle. And there's tons of ways in which you can explain this. So as you're learning, what top test takers do is they're constantly trying to figure out what the deeper principle is behind all of these things. Now that we understand how to spot these universal patterns, let's explore the crucial skill that separates good test takers from excellent ones: the ability to apply these patterns in any context. Understanding a principle is only half of the battle. The real challenge is being able to apply it in new situations, a skill that's known in education as transfer. The reason why transfer matters is many of the most difficult exams in the world, like the MCAT or the USMLEs, or even things like AP Physics or AP Chemistry, test your ability to transfer information. What this means practically is that they're going to test you on the same sets of principles, but they're going to change the context. This is why the people that are really good at memorizing or are good crammers, who might have done really well on their school exams, can still struggle on standardized tests. But the thing that's being tested by your professor might be something more akin to recall. The things that are tested on standardized exams are much more about transfer. This is also why you can take exams multiple times and see different questions, despite the fact that the principles are the same. We all know people who have learned things really well in the classroom, but then struggle to apply them in the real world. This is a problem that's vexed education researchers for decades. There's a lot of research into this, but the most important thing to remember in how to improve your ability to transfer information is that you want to practice it in the context in which you'll need it. This means that you want to have deliberate application across multiple different scenarios. You're taking a principle that you might have learned and transferring it to other places. For example, if I was going to make flashcards, I would make flashcards that force me to apply this principle. One of the flashcards might be something like cystitis. Use an underlying principle to explain the classic signs and symptoms. Then on the back, I would have an explanation explaining how, in general, inflammation increases the sensitivity of afferent receptors, and because of this, your bladder is going to feel more full, and therefore the reflex of needing to go to the bathroom is going to be triggered more quickly and more frequently. I might make another card that says post-viral URI coughing to talk about the general principle, explaining why this happens, as well as explaining how in this particular situation this principle can be applied. You can use this for, colitis and the many other situations, because every single time you're doing this, you're taking the principle and you're forcing yourself to to use it in the context that you're much more likely to need it. One mistake that I see is that when someone learns a principle, they only learn that principle. And then they just expect that magically they're going to be able to apply it regardless of what the situation is going to be on their exam. For example, in physics, with conservation of energy and how energy can't be created or destroyed, they might just memorize that thing. But then when they're actually faced with scenarios in which they need to apply that principle, say on an AP test or on their MCAT, then they might struggle. The way to overcome that is to make sure that you understand the principle, but you're also applying it and forcing yourself to apply it in your studying so that when you need to apply it to test or transfer later, you're able to do so easily. Now that you understand how to apply principles across different contexts, let's tackle perhaps the most overlooked aspect of elite performance: how to never forget what you've learned. We often confuse activity with progress. Reading 100 pages feels productive, but what if I told you that you're going to eventually forget all of the things that you learn every single day unless you have a good system for retention? Now, there's a lot of heterogeneity about like how much people forget and how fast people forget, but the one thing that I think everyone can agree on is that what we learn today, we are going to forget at some point in the future if we don't review that information or use it in some way. I've come up with what I call the memory equation to help quantify this and simplify the different elements necessary to increase our total knowledge. So the memory equation works like this: total knowledge equals the amount that we learn every day divided by the percent that we forget every day. Now, again, I realize that this is an oversimplification, but fundamentally, the principles are still true, right? How much you know is going to be a product of how much you learn and how much you forget. What this means is that if we wanted to increase our knowledge by 10 times, you can do it by one of two ways. You can either A, 10 times the amount that you learn per day, which is nearly impossible, or you can reduce how much you forget by 10 times, which is actually achievable. And the way that you achieve this is through a system called spaced repetitions. We have a lot of other videos about this in the channel, so make sure that you like and subscribe this video so that the algorithm can suggest those videos to you. Basic idea behind spaced repetition: it is a system that will show you information that you are about to forget so that you can remember it in the most efficient way possible. Practically, what this has allowed me to do is that for more than the last 15 years, I've made over 20,000 flashcards to remember everything important that I learned at Stanford Medical School, in residency at Harvard MGH, and beyond that, including things like economics concepts or Bible verses or other things that I just wanted to remember. The amount that I forget is less than 1% of all of that information every single day, and it only takes me about 15 to 30 minutes every day to actually maintain that knowledge. I cannot emphasize this enough, how incredible it was when I discovered how to use spaced repetition appropriately, not just like memorizing a bunch of random facts that people gave me, but actually taking the principles and the why and the concepts and the applications and actually putting them into flashcards that would force me to continue to apply and transfer that information so that I could constantly be practicing the information in the way that I was going to need it for my exams and in my life. If you haven't tried making your own flashcards, I highly recommend that you learn this skill, because there's no greater gift that you can give yourself in both the present and in the future than the ability to never forget something that you've learned in the most efficient way possible. So now that you understand why retention is your secret weapon, let me show you exactly how to implement this system in your daily study routine. So most of what we've discussed up until this point is how to build a stronger foundation. The next several principles that we're going to discuss are all about how to take that knowledge that you have and make sure that you don't get questions wrong for the things that you already know. Because the difference between average and exceptional scores often isn't knowledge. It's how deeply you are able to think about each question as you read it. I was reading through a test passage with my daughter once, and I had her narrate her thoughts on what it is that she was reading, like I do with students that I am coaching and tutoring. Kind of a similar mistake to what a lot of people make, which is that she would read the line and then she would just immediately start reading the next line. The reason why this is a mistake is that in general, for people that score lower on exams, they tend to read passively, just sentence by sentence. Whereas top scorers will analyze actively every sentence and are looking to connect the information between sentences. I'll give you an example of this for someone that might be studying for the USMLEs in medical school or who's trying to match into the United States. A 29-year-old woman is brought to the emergency department after she passes out when she returned from a nonstop flight from Seoul to Los Angeles. A low scorer typically is just going to start reading the next sentence, but a high scorer is going to stop and think, okay, like what are all the things that I could learn from this first sentence, and try to make as many connections as possible. So they might say, okay, well, they're brought to the emergency department. So this is already, we know this is a pretty serious condition, because a young person who can't even get themselves to the emergency department, like that's really severe. She passes out, so I've got to think in my head like, okay, so this is syncope. Typically, there's a decrease in blood flow to the brain. In most cases, means that she's hypotensive. And so I'm trying to figure out, how is there hypotension that's bad enough to cause someone to pass out and that's bad enough that they would need to be brought to the emergency department? And then I'm trying to connect that with the fact that she just returned from a nonstop flight from Seoul to Los Angeles. So that is kind of the classic venous stasis, where there's going to be blood pooling in your legs, and you might have a DVT or a blood clot that forms in your veins, and that blood clot then can travel to your heart and then shoot from your heart to the lungs. And so I've got to think, we call that a pulmonary embolism. So I've got to think, like, how could a pulmonary embolism cause hypotension that would be bad enough to cause me to pass out with syncope? And so then I would think, okay, well, it could happen, and because it blocks blood flow getting from the right heart to the left heart, then it would block blood from getting from the left heart to the rest of the body, and that could cause you to be hypotensive. From just the first sentence, I've got a very good idea of what's going on. And even if I'm wrong about one of the different steps, it'll become a lot easier for me to figure out where I made a mistake because I'm thinking about it deeply with every sentence. The next sentence might say something like, she smoked 1 pack of cigarettes daily for 10 years. Now, a low score is going to look at this and they're going to say, oh my gosh, like, okay, so she smoked, I don't know, maybe she's got like lung problems. A high score is going to look at this and say, okay, well, how does smoking relate to the first sentence, right? If I think she has a blood clot, how does smoking relate to that? Well, it relates because smoking increases the risk of getting a blood clot. Now that you know how to read questions more effectively, let's tackle another crucial execution skill that can help you improve your score today. One of the most dangerous test-taking habits isn't a lack of knowledge. Instead, it's getting locked into your first idea and missing the right answer sitting right in front of you. This is called anchoring. Anchoring means our mind is going to lock onto the first idea or diagnosis or solution, and it's going to create mental blinders to other options. This can happen even if you have all of the knowledge necessary to answer the question, and it's particularly dangerous with questions where they may be trying to confuse you by putting in distractors, or what we call noise. The solution to this is what I like to call rule in before rule out. What this means is you want to actively search for supporting evidence for each option first before you eliminate it. The reason for this is that you need to challenge your initial assumptions so that you don't get locked in to an answer choice that's wrong. For example, there was a student who got a question wrong recently that I was coaching where she thought the answer was gastroesophageal reflux or GERD. The patient was a young woman who had a nighttime cough, and because of this nighttime cough, immediately in her head, she thought, oh, GERD, must be GERD. Because she anchored on this, she missed in the next sentence where it talked about how the symptoms were independent of position, and there was a couple other things that kind of argued against it being GERD. The correct answer was asthma, which she did know was a possibility, but she had eliminated because she had just told herself, well, no, this can't be asthma because it's GERD. Instead, to make sure that you don't get questions wrong that you could be getting right, the way to double check it is when you see asthma as one of the answers, ask yourself, okay, well, what information supports this being asthma? In that case, you could say something like, well, asthma does give you a nocturnal cough. It does happen in young people. And then it would kind of dawn on you and be like, oh, actually, this could be asthma. Oh, let me look for other evidence for how I could differentiate between this and GERD. Now that you know how to avoid the anchoring trap, let's look at another crucial execution skill, knowing exactly when to move on from a difficult question. So for people that say that, oh my gosh, I struggle with timing, I'm always running out of time by the end of the block, the secret to perfect timing isn't reading faster, it's actually knowing when to move on. I call this the 30% rule. And the principle is this: you want to never spend more than 30% extra time per question. For example, if you've got 40 questions and you've got 60 minutes to do those 40 questions, you should have about 90 seconds per question. The reason for this is that oftentimes if you're having difficulty with timing, it's not because you're reading slow, it's because you're perseverating on questions that you don't have a good likelihood of getting them correct. For the questions that they spend more than 2 minutes, almost invariably, they are getting a lower percentage correct. So for example, I did this with a student recently, and for every question that they spent more than 2 minutes on, they scored roughly 50% on those questions. For the other questions where they spent less than 2 minutes, their average was closer to like 80 or 85%. My takeaway from this is two things. One, by spending all of that extra time when you're sitting there and you're like, oh no, like I know this, I just got to think about it a little bit more, right? The way to implement this is to just take your phone and set a timer for 2 minutes or whatever the amount of time is. If you have time at the end of the block, you can certainly come back, but don't let that one question steal time from other questions that would benefit from having that extra time. Today, we covered two paths to test-taking excellence: systematically building your knowledge and mastering execution strategies to make sure that the things that you know, you're actually getting correct on your exam. But knowing these principles is just the first step. If you want to see exactly how to apply these strategies to real questions, watch our next video, USMLE Test Taking Tips, from stuck between 2 answers to 260+.